Well, thank you. It is such an honour to have the opportunity to lead us off, Bob, on this tribute to you as you enter your 90th year. You know, and as current Westpac CEO, I have the opportunity to reflect from time to time on the extraordinary CEOs who've come before me. I feel so privileged to be part of this club of extraordinary CEOs who've had the carriage of the Westpac Group over time. And individuals who with their teams have built our company into what it is today. And this afternoon, we have the privilege amongst us to recognise one of our great leaders, Bob White, who was the Managing Director for a 10-year period from 1977 to 1987. And when I reflect on my now up to 5 years tenure of being a CEO today, I reflect on the enormous change over the past 5 years. I reflect on the global financial crisis, our merger with St. George Bank, the strong technology agenda that we've had to pursue over this period, and of course our customer-centered agenda. But then I started to reflect on Bob's period, the 10 years between 1977 and 1987, and I thought, great, guess what? That was a pretty big time of change as well, a pretty big agenda of change then. And as all of you know, it was the period of deregulation. So huge change for banks and financial services companies around the world and here within Australia, with impacts on competition. It was a period of very significant technology enhancement. It was the period when customers started to expect a lot more of their banks, partly because of the deregulation agenda. And there was certainly a need for efficiency and for productivity, for banks to think about how to run themselves in a different way. Well, from what I can see and from what I've read about Bob, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about this from other speakers who can tell us a little bit more of the detail as it happened at the time, Bob addressed these challenges absolutely head-on, and in many areas led in the industry. For example, in technology, whereas I understand it, Westpac was the provider of the first ATM and ATM card. How about that for a technology leadership position? While doing that, Bob also merged with the Commercial Bank of Australia. And under his leadership, our name changed. Remember Bank of New South Wales? And then, of course, the Commercial Bank of Australia need to find a new name. Well, it was Bob and his committee who recommended that we look at the Western Pacific Bank Corporation, which, of course, is our dear and wonderful Westpac. Bob also had to do the hard yards of management and leadership. So in the light of this backdrop of change, developed new systems of management, a very significant overhaul of the way the bank was structured to a much more decentralized approach. I'm sure many of you remember this. Who was around at the time? Who remembers this very significant change process that Bob actually put in place? We all were. And of course a new performance management system as well, the system that's still in place in lots of ways. It may not be called management by objectives anymore, but in lots of ways that's exactly what we're doing. And then some very specific and tight customer service metrics. I know that we also have Bob to thank for changing the way board meetings occurred as well. I believe boards met a lot more frequently and were a lot more involved and engaged with management style activities. I believe at one point they were meeting weekly to then go to 2 weekly, and it was under Bob's leadership that he said, you know what, I think once a month will do. So I am eternally grateful to Bob for that. Bob, there are several speeches today from people who I know you admire and respect so much, who are going to give us more insight into your career. But from me, what I'd like to say is a very big thank you for your leadership at a crucial time in our history, a time of significant change within the Australian marketplace. It is an honour for me to be a fellow CEO with you, a fellow Westpac CEO with you, and to acknowledge your values, the values you've lived and brought to bear in our organisation, your significant contribution, and in particular your care for people and your care for customers. So thank you very much. I honour you, I tribute you, and it's a delight for me to be here to kick off the celebration. Thank you very much.
It gives me great pleasure to say a few words about Bob as he settles into his 90th year, and I thank you, Steve, for the opportunity. In the mid-1950s, Bob joined the Victorian Inspector's Office from South Yarra branch, firstly as guarantee clerk and then as staff clerk under Jack Kenny. As well as Bob, at that time the office had rising stars, all of whom later found their way to Sydney. Jeff White, Neil Gibson, Neil Garn, Dick Wheeler, Jeff Petterson, Bruce Birchfield, Paul Ogden, Neville Allen and Peter Davison. As an aside, Paul Ogden, Neil Garn and I shared third prize in the old George Adams lottery. As young marrieds, we enjoyed many family gatherings, and in fact, Molly, Bob's late wife, was godmother to one of our daughters. When we came to Sydney in 1968, we settled in East Linfield. Jeff White lived further up our street, and Bob was around the corner. Jeff often referred impishly to Bob as his young brother. Later, as Bob's career was on the rise, Sir Robert Norman suggested he move on from East Linfield to where he now resides in Castle Cove. Bob was soon in high office and driven to work in the General Manager's car. I used to be given a lift to work by Gordon Davis, our transport manager, who had restored many cars down the years, including a Rolls Royce. We happened to be on the Harbour Bridge in the Rolls one morning, and Bob was ahead, but Gordon chose not to pass. I was amused, to say the least. These are just musings from the past. Bob has not changed down the years. He has always been generous with the time he gave to people and the bank in what has been a spectacular career for the boy from Conago. Thank you.
Like you say at the outset, it's lovely to follow Jeff Walker, one of the wonderful managers I had in Sydney office early in my career, and a true gentleman. Thanks, Jeff. When Steve Pollock first informed me of the intention to present this tribute to Bob White and his wonderful contribution to the bank over more than 50 years, it prompted me to recount an anecdote to Steve about an extremely generous gesture I witnessed from Bob White some years ago. Steve agreed that it perfectly exemplified the outstanding character of the man and the reasons why he was and remains so highly regarded by his thousands of colleagues who served with him in the Bank of New South Wales and Westpac. The matter has its origins in Bob's outstanding support and enthusiasm for the bank staff club. And it's also its member clubs, such as the 1817 Car Club, which I understand is, by coincidence, is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, and of which Bob remains patron today. Although I had contact with Bob at various stages of my career, during the last 6 years of my service in the organisation, I served as president of the Bank Staff Club and witnessed firsthand the outstanding support that Bob gave to the club and its various member clubs. In fact, long after his retirement, he still showed commitment by travelling into the city to attend annual general meetings on relevant evenings or other events that were conducted by the club. Now, many of you will remember Diane Benham, who may be here today. I think she was going to come, but many of you probably remember her more by her maiden name of Diane McKim, because Di looked after the operations of the staff club and the staff shop for a number of years. When Diane left the bank to commence her family, Bob, by that time long retired, organised and hosted and paid for a luncheon at the city's restaurant together with Jan to acknowledge and thank Diane for her contribution to the staff club and to the bank over those many years. Along with other members of the staff club committee, I was privileged to be invited to attend that luncheon. Bob's generosity in organising and hosting the event was significant in itself. But during the course of the luncheon, Bob produced a small ring box and told Diane that when he was born, a very good close friend of his mother pressed a gold sovereign into each of his hands and expressed a wish to the effect that he should want for nothing during the course of his life. Bob's words to Diane were simple and sincere as he passed the box containing one of those sovereigns to her. When your child is born, I would like for you to press this coin into its hand with the same wish. I can tell you it was an extremely moving occasion and it's touched the emotions of everyone present. Bob, I know that the event took place in an essentially private setting, and I'm sure you probably never expected that it would be aired in such a public forum as this. So I hope you'll forgive me if I've breached any confidences. The baby born to Diane and Michael Benham in that year is now a young lady of 16 years, and I can tell you that despite the passing of all that time, none of the people who sat around the table on that day forget the sincerity, thoughtfulness and generosity you displayed. Steve Pollock and I, together with Diane and Michael Benham, felt that the story deserved to be told as it perfectly demonstrated that the private man is every bit as exceptional as the public persona of Bob White. Best wishes always, Bob.
I cannot tell you what an honour it is to present this tribute to our colleague and friend, Bob White. There are many in this room who have known Bob much longer than I and would be far better positioned to reveal the story of Bob's earlier career in the bank. My first meeting did not occur until a little later when he assumed the role of relieving chief manager and was sent to Perth to relieve Maitland James as the chief manager in Perth. I knew that might strike a chord with some of you. Well, Maitland was taking his annual Christmas leave, as he always did, in 1971. But I'm ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning. Bob first saw the light of day in a small southwestern riverina farming village called Conago. Although in the state of New South Wales, in case you didn't know, Conago was one of the many towns located far closer to Melbourne than to Sydney. And he went to the local one-teacher school for his primary education, but had to travel to Deniliquin to attend high school and then on to Hay for the final 2 years. His principal interest outside the classroom was debating, a skill which became useful in his later business life. If truth be known, Bob and some of his mates were probably responsible for the Second World War. In 1939, Bob proudly led the school debating team against Albury High, debating the subject that the colonies taken from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles be returned. Bob's team argued for the case for the negative and won. He was advised to ensure that he had a secure job, and after an early unsuccessful attempt to join the Bank of New South Wales, he was finally admitted as a probationer and started at Echuca branch on the 26th of February 1940. His application form was marked approved as a special matter. And his starting salary was £90, plus an away from home allowance of £55. And after the first year, he was rewarded with an increase in salary of £15, which was promptly deducted from his away from home allowance. Now, the war caught up with Bob in 1942 when he enlisted with the army just 5 days before the bombing of Darwin. And it was in Darwin that Bob was to spend most of his war years. 5 long years were to pass before Bob returned to the bank. And not long after his return, the banks in Australia became embroiled in the bank's anti-nationalisation campaign. Like many of his colleagues, Bob was sent to argue the case. The twin objectives of the campaign was firstly to convince the public that the proposed nationalisation was not in the best interest of Australia, and secondly, to unseat the Chifley Labor government. Now, by now in his mid-20s, Bob was well and truly flirting with politics, which had been encouraged earlier by his former English and history teacher at Hay High School. Fortunately for the bank and us, Bob's contemplation to enter politics did not last. As he put it in his memoirs, I quickly came to the conclusion that there was an infinitely more entertainment for the audience in the farce which would continue on the political stage than there was for the cast. And I mentioned that episode in Bob's life because one of the attributes of Bob which I came to enjoy many years later as a senior executive was listening to the long dissertations on the current state of politics in Australia and the implication for the bank. When he spoke to us, mainly after a bank dinner, Bob never referred to notes. he demonstrated to me that he had a deep knowledge and understanding of the political issues facing the bank and Australia generally. As a bachelor in the late 40s, Bob suffered from the vagaries of staff policies and attitudes and was precluded from a housing loan and discouraged from continuing his part-time university studies. His passion for banking, stimulated from the intensive work in the nationalisation campaign, enabled him to pursue a career. And it wasn't long before the bank noticed this bright and dedicated young man, and he was appointed to the then Inspector's Office in Melbourne. After 5 years, and now married, he was selected to be sent to London. And Bob quickly realised that London was the centre of the financial world and would open his eyes to the importance of trade and international banking. He was also able to see at first hand the iconic institutions and buildings in London at first hand, at which he had learned so much at school. He was the first foreign banker to attend the Midland Bank Staff College, and a year later attended the International Banking Summer School in Bavaria. He was a long way from the Riverina in the outback New South Wales. Bob returned to Australia from London in 1958, and the appointment in London had a significant influence on him, and the experience was to be held in good stead in the years ahead. He was asked to develop a program of senior training and became the first administrator at Maratta Staff College. He was then exposed to the bank's inner sanctum by being appointed General Manager's Accountant and working directly for the Chief Executive. For the next 3 years, he observed at first hand how the executive management and the directors of the bank operated. Various appointments followed in quick succession to Sydney office, New Zealand, and in the Chief Accountant's office. And in 1970, Bob returned to Sydney office as manager just in time to strike the stock exchange boom. Many of the brokers were customers of Sydney office and were hopelessly out of control, processing their buy and sell orders flowing through the system. Bob was faced with a dreaded decision to authorise the payment of cheques which were way outside their limit arrangements. If he were to dishonour the cheques, the broker would have been delisted and become bankrupt. And there was not much support from head office, and it became a good example of the advantage of Bob's close relationships with his customers. His steady nerve and thoughtful approach allowed him to save the bank from serious embarrassment and loss, despite some pretty heated discussions with some of his customers. It was a tough and testy time. After Sydney office, Bob was appointed to a position called Relieving Chief Manager. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was from this position I first came to meet him. He was asked to conduct a cost of administration review, and as he was relieving in Perth, he commenced the exercise with us. First impressions always count, and I can say that he really impressed me. Decisive, hard-working, thorough, determined, and in cricket parlance, nothing went through to the keeper. He well and truly put us through the hoops to justify the staffing levels and procedures within the Chief Manager's office. John Chatterton says that he was in a similar position in the Chief Manager's office in Brisbane and spent a day with Bob, who he had not met previously. John went home that day and said to his wife that he had met the most impressive young man that he had ever come across in the bank up to that time. It was close to Christmas, and Bob asked me to show him where the shops were in Perth. So we walked up to Hay Street in the centre of the city, which by then was turned into a mall, except for buses. And we were attracted to a bit of street theatre, and we stood there together in the middle of the roadway watching the performers. I felt a gentle bump on my shoulder, once, then twice, and the third time I looked around to see a bus trying to push us out of the way. The succession planning of the bank almost faltered that morning. Bob had no sooner settled into his relief in Perth when a long telex was received from Walter Pearce in the staff office, saying that a substantial amount of money was missing from a shipboard agency on board P&O's Orchides, making its way to London via Fremantle. We were informed that the bank's investigation officer from Sydney would arrive shortly with instructions to board the ship at sea off the port of Albany. And I observed Bob's thorough organising capability as he immediately took charge of the issue. Regrettably, the money was never found, and it was to be the last shipboard agency ever conducted by the bank. Careers in the bank sometimes take a strange course, and Bob was appointed to the position of Chief Manager for the United Kingdom and Europe in 1972, and it was not to be smooth sailing. The UK government had introduced a pay freeze at a time when many foreign banks were opening branches in London. The bank was losing staff and unable to increase salaries to compete. A frustrated staff voted to join a union differently than that of the big local banks. And while the Bank of New South Wales was the first foreign bank to open in London, it was the first to be unionised. Again, head office was not overly helpful, and as John Chatterton, who by then was head of personnel in London, recalls, it was a very embarrassing time. Strike action was threatened, and without the calm, open and honest manner in which Bob talked to the staff at a mass meeting, the division would have closed down until agreement was reached on many outstanding issues. Despite the industrial challenges, the worsening UK economy, the substantial increase in world oil prices, and the heartbreaking decision to close Sackville Street branch, Bob derived much from his time in London. He developed some very strong personal relationships with the staff, which last to this day. He also established many business relationships to be useful later in his career. Additionally, he became familiar with the workings of the new and dynamic euro-dollar market. Now, Bob had only been in London for about 18 months when he received a telex from head office informing him that he'd been appointed general manager, a level immediately then below the chief executive, Sir Robert Norman. Thinking there must have been a mistake and the telex should have read assistant general manager, he tried to think who he should call. The telephone rang. It was the London Advisory Board chairman to offer him congratulations. The chairman's message was clear. Bob had jumped a level and was to return to Sydney as one of the two general managers. While in London, the Whitlam Labor government came to power in Canberra. The economy had taken a turn for the worse, liquidity was very tight, and Rex Connor, the Minister for Minerals and Energy, was scanning the world to borrow petrodollars to finance the pipeline network dream. To say the least, it was an interesting time to return to Australia. In October 1975, Sir Robert Norman departed on an extended overseas trip and Bob was left in charge of the bank. Yet again, Bob was to face a further crisis. About a week before the Governor-General withdrew Prime Minister Whitlam's commission, Bob had to work through a difficult decision when the government sought to arrange for the banks to lend monies to its public servants and their suppliers.